Strategy Sessions by Thirsty Bandit Consulting, Episode 26, Morality in Leadership. Greetings, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Strategy Sessions. I'm Corey Kraychek, and I'm joined with Rachel Brown. And Rachel, we are on episode 26. 6 episodes into season 2, man. We're really kind of hitting our stride here.
I was literally thinking this morning, I was like, oh my gosh, like we ended at this. How many are we into this one? Like, I feel like time is just flying and I think we're kind of getting our groove down now.
Yeah, it's like Pokemon, right? And I'm not like a big Pokemon guy, but
Okay.
like every edition that comes out, like you collect. Okay, my kids used to collect Pokemon. Like you get like, oh, like who's out in this series, right? You get these like new guys, and like you set them aside, and you kind of collect these little dudes that have different powers. And I feel like season 1, like we had our like base set of our collection, like of our guests, and now season 2, we've got these like really interesting new like exotic guests who we haven't had a chance to really interface a bunch with. So like we're in like season 2 pack of our Pokemon, and we're like ready to like, gotta catch them all, Rach. So I guess we're
Slowly but
we're
surely.
we're catching our next group. Actually, no, you know what that reminds me of? Do you remember when like that like Pokemon Go app was the thing?
Yes, I
And it
do.
was so bizarre, running a winery that had those like Pokemon
Like the
Go
gyms.
legit. So people would just be showing up to the property and taking pictures of
Like you have a Charizard here really quick. Hang on, I gotta go run down to your field.
Yeah, yep,
Yep.
yep.
What a time.
I truly did not think we were going to talk Pokemon at the beginning of this podcast. It was not in my show notes. And poor Kimberly, our guest, is like, oh my God, what did I sign up for? But it's always nice to start with kind of something weird and different at the beginning of our podcasts. I promise that we're not going to go super deep into Pokemon unless she wants to during the chat. She's nodding no. So, but let me do a little intro, Rach, because I know this is the first time you're having a chance to chat. But today's guest is Dr. Kimberly McGlonn. She's an educator. She's a social entrepreneur. She's a thought leader. She really focuses on ethical leadership, purpose-driven businesses, and really that intersection that commerce and social responsibility have, and which really isn't. Yeah, I'd like to think, and a lot of the reading I'm doing now is that finally in 2026, I believe social responsibility isn't it isn't like a nice thing to have. It's a thing that you have to have, and it's just become part of the fabric, ingrained into the fabric of organizations, and not sort of a shiny piece that you can say, well, this is what differentiates us from other businesses. No, you just need to have it. Her book, Build It Boldly: How Daring Business Leaders Can Gain Influence and Create Impact, is sort of a guide like for folks like this, and it kind of provides hard-earned, honest reflections on the values of relationships and mindsets and storytelling and fundraising and wellness, and it really pulls together these best practices from influential leaders who have and have all been sort of disheartened by the consequences when it's just business as usual and you're not factoring these things in. And so, as you can imagine, right, because what we do on strategy sessions is look at everything through the lens of hospitality, that we feel that this perspective is really relevant for the things that we discuss, right? I mean, we're an entire industry that's built on service and trust and human connection. And so, I think that at a time where there are so many leaders that are asking these deeper questions and knowing that they're like fully entrenched in this now, right? Whether it's culture, responsibility, or impact, sustainability, all the things that we've discussed in previous. Kimberly challenges us to think about leadership just not as a path of growth, but as an opportunity to create environments where people they feel valued, they feel safe, they feel connected to something larger than themselves, right? And that's what the really good brands do, and particularly the hospitality brands, that they can do this effortlessly because it's ingrained into who they are as a brand. So we're going to explore that today, right? I mean, we're going to explore how to align profit with purpose and the role that morality plays with leadership decisions, and ultimately how businesses, especially in our hospitality space, can create these cultures where people and communities thrive. So, with that, Kimberly, welcome to Strategy Sessions. And I promise we will not ask any more questions about Pokemon and we will stay on task. But thanks for joining us today for this session.
It's great to be here. I mean, I'm reluctant, but I'm gonna share it anyways. I don't know anything about Pokemon. So if we stayed in that lane, I'd have very little to contribute. So I'm here for the shift and I'm so glad to join you and to meet you both and chat with you both and to say hello to the listening audience. Hey everybody.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, and that's okay. And admittedly, again, I've only tangentially am familiar with Pokemon. It's just, obviously it's a culture thing, and it's a huge part of many people's lives. So we, do not want to say anything negative about Pokemon. If that's your
No,
thing,
I'm
that's
here
your
for
thing.
Pokemon. I'm here for
Exactly.
Pokemon. I'm just not expertise. There are many people who know much more.
Well, hopefully the algorithms will expose our podcast to some Pokemon lovers who also really want practical strategies in hospitality. But I kind of want to start with hospitality because that's our business, right? And we know very much so that hospitality businesses walk this tightrope between financial performance and then ultimately caring for employees, guests, and communities. We actually had a great podcast in season 1 with Joseph Quintella, who is the director of operations for SPB Hospitality and Garces Group, where we talked about efficiencies versus experience, and ultimately, how can you be a salient, viable, solvent business while still delivering all of the things that people want to feel, right? They want to be cared for. And so, from your perspective, I mean, what does it look like for an organization to really truly align profit with purpose rather than just treating them as competing priorities, right? Trying to have it all as not as saying that, look, if we do this for our guests or our employees, then we're gonna have to sacrifice something on the other side.
I as someone who has been in the world of figuring out how to cater to the needs of customers and also holding space for employees, I've really shifted the locus of my focus, and I think this is the opportunity we all have to really, from an intentional design perspective, thinking about how are we advancing, protecting, honoring what's in the best interest of the common good. And I think we've been conditioned by way of inherited culture to really, to your point, only center to some extent what is driving profit, and to a lesser extent, how are we putting the pursuit of profit and purpose into this binary competition. And the workaround there is from a design perspective. How are we building systems that work together to support a mutuality of needs? And that just takes a lot of from the ground up focus. It takes persistent care over time, and it takes a future minded I think approach to business design and business leadership, which we can have. We just have to cultivate it.
Yeah, it's so interesting how some of our conversations tend to build off of one another. We had this incredible guest a few episodes back where we talked about emotional design, and implementing emotional design in brand strategy and organizational design. And I think that's an interesting starting point for some folks, because we have always been trained, you know, through my master's degree program into the real world, engaging in strategic planning practices, right? You're always taught to do mission, vision, value statements, that sort of sets the tempo for what that company or that organization is supposed to be. But rarely, I felt, did we ever factor in what emotions do you want others to feel about your organization? And I think that that's a really interesting way in 2026 to look at building out an organization, is saying, um, what are the core emotions that you want that people to feel from your brand? Is it joy? Is it safety? Is it honesty? I mean, there are obviously there are many of these things that I think transcend any company, but there should be these really interesting elements that you could say, how do we achieve these and how do we make that felt on the front line, back of house, our guests, our employees, the our audience as a whole, and looking at it through emotion, I think is just a different way to do that. Any thoughts? Have you worked at all with kind of emotional design in that concept? Or I mean, certainly you can see some parallels, right, when we're talking through this.
Absolutely. I mean, I have a career portfolio, so I am a writer, and I do a lot of, at scale teaching about a number of things, a number of approaches to business design, and specifically to leadership. And one of the things that I think about a lot is what you're describing, which is essentially how are we designing things with a sense of emotional literacy? Really considering ourselves as shepherds of how people will experience from a felt perspective what we're offering. And in my role as vice president of social impact at Fiddler Club, I think a lot about how we're driving meaningful integration. And so much of that is creating bridges and tunnels sometimes to help people understand and find new ways to interact with each other in authentic ways and sincere ways where they can bring their whole selves and their individuality and still preserve a sense of safety. And I think that notion of the emotional design piece, the emotional literacy piece in my own language, it's one pillar that is so important, right? We talk about the interior design, maybe we talk about the visual story and how we're making people, how doorways create invitation and how curtains create intimacy. I think another pillar there is which is fundamental to business design, particularly in hospitality, but this is a new layering to how we think about business function, which is how does it add value and benefit to the world writ large, right? To our local neighborhoods, to the cities where we do business, and then to the global footprint. So I think we're at a place where when we hear that kind of language, we think about maybe it's sustainability. Maybe it's like, oh, I think what we should do is think about how we're measuring energy or, what we're doing with our waste. And that is a part. But there's a larger pillar, I think, that our employees, particularly, so from an inside out perspective, are looking for, which is how does the work that I do drive my own sense of personal meaning? That emotion that we oftentimes cast into how do our business partners, our customers, how do they experience us? It neglects that all of us are looking for more meaning in our lives. And how are we as employers in hospitality also aligning our offering with the larger conversation about what is this business design doing for the future? What are the benefits and the liabilities of how we approach all of those things? And how are we aligning it to thinking about, and asking bigger questions? Are we acting with a sense of morality? Are we demonstrating a sense of moral courage in the positions that we take? Is there any sense of coherence around why we say yes and why we say no and what's for sale and what's not? And I think that we're in an era or a burgeoning era of that being really at the top of people's minds and hearts as they make decisions about where they spend their money and who they work for.
Yeah, no, that's a fascinating perspective on that. I mean, I love because we talk about this, but sometimes it's hard to communicate the concept, right? But when you're hiring practices, we talk about brand ambassadors, right? Or we talk about how do you build brand ambassadors and who are your best ones? Well, your employees are your best brand ambassadors, right? I mean, you want to hire people that are enthusiastic about you, and the best way to do that is to make sure that they have a clear understanding of who you are and ensuring that who you are aligns with who they are. And that is the easiest, most effective way to increase morale, increase retention, increase buy-in, increase and through all that increased sales and profitability. But it all starts with making sure that the right people are aligned with you and they feel you beyond just the paycheck.
Yes, and I think that as leaders in this moment, there's so many things that we have to shoulder. And this notion of having to make sure that we are communicating first for ourselves, that we have a sense of clarity around how we arrive at our decisions. What's that inner governance, that inner architecture that, makes us determine how we're setting our wages or how we're thinking about what we're incentivizing. All of that has to be somehow, I think, in this new world, it has to be placed in that deeper sense of, what is, in an old school way, in a Mr. Rogers way, what's the right thing to do? And in a contemporary language, in a mature language, what is the moral thing to do? And I think that whether we use that precision of language or not, we are all, I think, we have a new opportunity to think differently about the power of our leadership and what it means to be a leader, and really thinking about even leadership in hospitality as a sense of a sacred responsibility. People arrive at our doors and they're yes, they're looking to be safe, they're looking to be taken care of. Is that something that we can actually offer them if we are not morally clear as individuals? And I don't think that it is. I don't think it's something that we are even capable of offering people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like we're talking about this, like we're talking about like all these trade-offs and being in a leadership kind of position and making these decisions where you have like efficiency versus empathy versus growth versus sustainability. So, like if you're in this position, if you're in a leadership position, like how should we be thinking about morality when we're making these decisions, because they're going to impact the business and the people within it, right? Like it's a twofold thing across the board.
It really is. And I think one of the things that I am learning and reading about and listening to as I travel the country is is that oftentimes morality, while we have maybe a quiet voice that tells us this is right or this is wrong, or this feels good or this feels bad, so much of that is how are we developing practices that even allow us to hear that voice? How are we making within our own lives some sense of sacred protection around practices that encourage us to be still, practices that encourage us to be alone, experiencing solitude, practices that allow us to be silent? And there's so I think that we have come to we're conditioned to think that to be a leader is about your title, to be a leader is about your degree, but there are all of these other practices and pursuits that people who take on the responsibility of leadership have to learn to embody before they can shoulder that burden of even deciding what is my inner compass telling me is the right or the wrong thing to do right now, and what makes something right and what makes something wrong. So this is a whole new way of questioning how we're arriving at decisions, which is a different question of why, and being clear about we're making these decisions because they're good for the bottom line and they're driving profit, so we're setting margins in this way. And we recognize that if we set margins in this way, and yes, it'll increase profitability. What does that enable us to do? Morally, it enables us to invest more in marketing, but it might also enable us to give bonuses. How do we hold that balance? So it's a new line of questioning. Morality is really about questioning, what's the impetus for your decision making? What is the harm that you're creating in the way that you make decisions? That those are the liabilities. And what are the potentialities that you open up if you get ever more intentional about, what you're doing when and for whom, So I do think that's a great question. It unlocks more questions.
Yeah, the measurables become the challenge, and the disconnect sometimes between um, accounting and human interaction, and not being able to see the ROI, right? That always becomes a challenge. It's well, why do we give bonuses, or why do we do a company wide event? Why do we do these things when they don't translate into dollars? And
And
because
that's
they
because, Corey, that we're only saying that dollars are the ROI that matter. And
yes.
that is the crux of so much of the suffering that
Hmm.
people in the cities where we do business, like it's hard to have a hotel that people want to go to and around you, and then in the neighborhood surrounding as are looking for parking. The neighborhood is experiencing all the kind of fallouts of decisions that have only been made in calculation with the pure only one KPI of profit. And I think that we have to get more creative about how we tell stories, quantitative stories of the decisions that we're making outside of simply just that dollar line. And that's the new conversation about impact writ large.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny, very timely. I was reading an article in Inc. magazine earlier today, actually, and it was looking at Schoolhouse Electric. I don't know if you're familiar with that brand. It was a lifestyle, well, it was really a lifestyle position home goods brand based out of Portland, Oregon, right? So they did kind of like a restoration hardware, kind of vibe, but definitely more eclectic and a little bit more vintage vibe to it. And they built this tremendous community, right? And were purchased, like many are through private equity. And over the course of 4 years, the business had to file for bankruptcy because the focus on profitability became the number one thing. And all of the systems, all of the culture, everything was dismantled around this quest for a better P&L. And I mean, listen. There are plenty of articles and podcasts and resources out there bashing the role that private equity plays in destroying like beloved brands. But it's just yet another example of when you start to lose sight of all of the other things, right? The the sales are will quickly go away, and that's where you're absolutely right. I think the ability to quantify and measure beyond profitability is imperative because, like it or not, there are very few tools out there that are ever going to show the true value, but we know it exists, right? We know it exists. And there was a quote in this article that said something. It was like something to the lines of like they wanted to know where the magic. And I thought that that was really an interesting way to phrase it because the magic is all of the things that you're mentioning. You know, it's they built this culture. The people that worked there bought into it, believed in it, and aligned with their own personal values. They shared that with the world, and then consumers bought into it, and it was a real thing. It's not magic. It's authenticity. It's it's honest truthfulness that they believed in this. And they're not looking, I mean, yeah, was the furniture cool? Of course it was cool, but they were buying it not because it was just cool. They were buying because they believed in the brand because it meant something deeper to them. And I think that that is it's a cautionary tale for any brand that starts to chase a percentage or two more on a margin. Um, and looking to cut things that could directly impact everything we've talked about up to this point.
Yeah, ironically, I think that, I appreciate your use of the word magic. I would call that same thing the light. The irony of like this is a company that sold it was light fixtures, right? Furniture light
Mhm.
fixtures.
Yeah, yeah,
Right? And then by deciding to acquiesce, to take a knee to a simpler narrative, which is tied solely to an end game of profit, what you lose is character. Right? So I think we have to think about the businesses that we build as all existing along a narrative, an art narrative arc. There has to be a character that's at the heart of it. That's heroic. That's the brand. And then the way that you tell that story is like, how are you using those other KPIs to create the plot points of why you are actually a fleshed out real thing. And I think as we also enter into this other era, which is of things that are inauthentic and produced through AI specifically, humans are going to be looking for stories that still anchor the light, that still anchor a sense of the experience, the emotion, the connection, the intimacy, the richness, the truth, the efforting to defend something that feels noble, whether it's like, you're going to a resort in the Maldives and you want something that is honoring the natural world. We are wired for the do good. And if we're not wired for the do good and we're wired for the profit, I wonder to what extent we're actually being wired for a deeper and darker sense of actually, of, I don't know, for lack of a better word, is it psychosis? Is it sociopathy? Where we are so obsessed with the pursuit of profit that we will do anything for the sake of the chase. And that is, I think, the call of leaders who are thinking about morality is that question of, who's the hero in the story of this brand? And if the hero is the customer, how do you craft an understanding of that customer and that consumer profile that speaks to a person who is decent? And if we lose all sight of decency, then why should anyone give us our dollars?
yeah. No, you're absolutely right. It's that age-old question, right? I mean, what defines happiness? What is it that makes you? Is it money? Is it material goods? Is it personal connections? Is it health and well-being? Only you can answer that about yourself. But if the collective is too skewed one way or the other, then I think things just naturally come out of balance.
And
Um,
I would go further. I would say if we acquiesce, if we give in to being a global society that only cares about the pursuit of just How do we get more? How do we make more money? How do we get richer? How do we, if that's the way that this goes, there are going to be more losers than winners.
Sure. Well, we know that for a fact. I mean, that's obviously, you just have to look around. I mean, there's certainly even right now, right? There's that's certainly the case. But let's talk about it from an individual perspective for a second, right? I mean, aligning personal needs and ambitions. There's nothing wrong with being ambitious and having your own personal needs. And doing your best as a human to position them towards a broader good. And I think in workplaces, particularly service oriented ones, I think that there's a lot of pressure, obviously, on leaders and managers to do their best to instill some of those values into their staff and their workplace. Again, going back to a value alignment and some other things. But as individuals, for personal growth, right? How are, what kinds of practices, what kinds of actions should the individual take themselves to continuously find strength and growth for a collective mission, not only for themselves, but for the organization? I mean, what kind of reaffirmations, what kind of activities should they try to engage in, you think?
I think that that's a beautiful core question. And I think that the first thing that we all have to really commit ourselves to is the choice. And this is a belief. You use the word belief. What do we believe? We have to choose that a positive future is possible. We have to protect our optimism in that sense, because if we don't think that a better way is possible, if we don't think that new systems are possible, if we don't think that there's a future worth fighting for, whether it's for our own, enjoyment, or our kids' enjoyment, or our niece and nephew's enjoyment, if we don't first make the choice there's a possibility that the forces of light, the forces of kindness, the forces of shared joy, that they are actually more powerful than the energy that tells us to move into rugged individualism, then we lose before we even start. So that is a fundamental core first position, is that, wow, I'm going to choose to believe that the future is worth fighting for. I'm going to choose to believe that good things are on the horizon and possible for us all. They're possible for me. And I'm going to hold that line. And I think the second thing that we have to do after we make that positional kind of directional choice is that we have to believe that in that pursuit of that positive future, that we recognize that we have something to contribute. That is not just about what we get, what we're taking from this horizon, but that we have something individually that we want to offer to it in service of it. And that's a personal journey of discovering. Maybe you're traveling back in time to when you were 9 or 10 and you're thinking about, what did I love to do for hours? That might be my gift. I love to paint. I love to draw. I'm going to pursue that and offer that to society as a way of contributing something positive to the now. And so the notion of like, I wanna, I want the world to be nice. I want the world to be better. That's a nice sentiment theoretically, but the action is what makes that a reality. And that becomes saying, "Oh, there's something in the world that I see is missing. I want to contribute it. And I think that there's more than one way I can do that. I think through my work, I can do that, right? I think the world needs to be more kind. So in my hospitality role, I'm going to really anchor what it means to serve with a spirit of kindness. And then there's what I'm going to do in my personal life. I'm going to start to volunteer, or I'm going to like gather my friends, and we're going to do a cleanup of that creek down the way that I like to hike past on the weekends. So I do think that, as we move towards this posture, that a positive future is possible. As we move to action, I'm going to align my gifts with something that serves the common good. I think then we naturally kind of orient away from the things that zap our enthusiasm for life. And I think that that's a major cultural crisis that we're in right now, is that there's a widespread sense of kind of defeat that we have to acknowledge and we have to reject.
Yeah. Rach, you know what this reminds me of? When we had David Dressler on one of our last podcasts, we were talking about the power of ritual.
Yeah.
And what David likes to do is he spends 10 to 15 minutes every morning in meditation. He does a mindfulness session. But what I thought was equally fascinating, and I haven't since our podcast, Rach, I have not done that yet. I need to do that, but he keeps an active personal, I don't know if it's a mission statement. I forget what he
It's a
calls it.
yeah, mission statement, like mantra, I think. Mantra
And
was the word.
it's constantly under revision. So he'll exit his meditation and then he reads his affirmations to himself as to what he wants to do. And then he reflects on that and then decides, um, I yeah, this isn't exactly where I am now, and then continues to change it. So obviously he acknowledges, as we all should, that we are a constant work in progress. But I love what we didn't talk about during that podcast and what you just touched upon is this sense of the necessity for optimism, which I love. I mean, I really do love that, that it's needed. We need it as humans. We need to be able to believe that we can aspire and experience good things. Um, it's the number one way to motivate, I would imagine.
It's up there. I mean, Forbes just released a study that said that less than 10% of people believe that that the people who they work for, their executives, are moral. Less than 10%
My
have
gosh, that's
full
insane.
perception that their
Yeah.
leaders are moral. And so I have that same sense of shock. And I think underneath that is, why is that a crisis? Right. And I think that that's something we all have to answer for ourselves. Why is it a crisis that so many of us, 90%, believe that we work for immoral people? Right. And in the worst case scenario, or maybe a better case scenario, they're not necessarily immoral. They're just amoral, right? They just don't even, they're not like going against the core morality. They just don't have morals. So I think that that's a question that we need to sit with. And I think that we, as those who are aspiring to morality, to your point about that last guest, we have to develop and defend practices that boost our own right relationship with what it means to be moral, because we can't aspire to positive futures absent from morality. Otherwise, those positive futures are so rooted in what could be a brute selfishness that then we become immoral, right? That our amorality becomes immoral. I have a book coming out in 2 weeks called The Leader's Work, my second book. And The Leader's Work is all about that pursuit of the internal landscape that allows you to actually understand who you are and where you are. My mantra is, I am here now. In a busy world, sometimes it's like, am I living in the past? Am I living in the future? I can only be in one room. I can only be in one role. I am here now. And from there, it's, how am I pursuing those practices of silence, stillness, solitude? How am I thinking about what I'm planting, what I'm weeding, how I'm thinking about pruning things from my plate and my life? There's a lot of things that we as leaders have to do outside of our 9 to 5 or our 9 to 7 that are not about anyone else. They're just about being in right relationship and observation and radical acceptance of ourselves. And from there we lead. From there we stand sturdy in a storm, and we become a place of reliability for the teams, particularly in hospitality, for the customers, the guests who are looking to us for that sense of center.
Well, and that kind of, I think, goes into like if you have a really good hospitality environment, the people come in can feel that. They feel safe, they feel welcome. There's nothing better than having somebody sit down and like kind of watching that ease unfurl, right? And that comes from your staff and training and like, you do the work outside of this and you bring it in. But then from like a leadership perspective too, I guess to kind of like cultivate that, then what does it take outside of those things to create a very sincere sense of psychological and emotional safety within the team so they can show up and they can do that? Because it is very cyclical. They do all feed into each other, and then it ends up in your user experience, essentially.
It does. And I think so much of it is really truly about, when people come to you and they're looking for that place of safety, the first thing is that you have to be a person who is aspired to creating a sense of of core clarity around who you are and what you're seeking and what you're aspiring to. So that first stage is not how people experience you, it's how do you understand yourself. And I think we have a lot of people who have a lot of authority to make decisions and they lack complete self-awareness. So they cannot be a safe space because they are not there. There's no clarity within their own individual ecosystem to offer that sense of safety. So, whether that's a spiritual practice, whether that's therapy, whether that's a workout routine, people who aspire to being seen as leaders, as being seen as those safe spaces to allow other people to unfurl. I love that word. That word reminds me of the image of the ancient fern plant. When you see a fern before it's fully unfolded itself, it has to literally unfurl. And that means that the conditions for that have to be safe. So, as leaders, what are we doing within the soil of ourselves? Right? If we go back that plant analogy, what are we doing this of ourselves? How are we making sure we're watered? How are we being careful about what we intake as a source of light? Right? We have to dismiss some things. We can't entertain everything. How do we become more protective of our own ecosystems? And in that same, just extending that metaphor, the French philosopher Voltaire said that I need to weed my own garden. So as leaders, how are we weeding our own garden so that when other people come to be in proximity to us, it's obvious that we have done that self exploration, excavation, and that there's room for them. If we haven't weeded our own gardens, we don't even allow a place for other people to plant themselves near us. So that work is really so much about what we often avoid, which is it's easy for leaders to be critical of other people, to observe other people, and to avoid self-examination. But there are very few leaders in human history who are admirable and noble, who have not developed those kinds of practices that allow them to see themselves and then to offer something to other people that is a reflection of the same kindness that they have for themselves.
Yeah, I would take it even another step further, and the willingness for leaders to show some degree of vulnerability around their staff, and that there are varying degrees of that, but showing their teams who they are, being comfortable enough, right? Knowing thyself and being comfortable enough to show people who they are. And if they are moral individuals, there's surely nothing to hide at that point. It could be different if they're amoral or immoral, they may want to naturally have that guise up. And I also feel again within organizations, the more that's at stake, the higher profile the leader, I feel a lot of times the more pressure there is to be closed off, to be constrained, to provide a veneer. And I think a degree of vulnerability goes a really long way in getting that buy-in and showing that safety and showing that there is a willingness that here you have somebody that is respected in business communities, makes a lot of money, makes decisions for this organization, but they're willing to show a piece of themselves.
I agree.
And
I agree with that. I do
yeah,
agree. I do think though that vulnerability, there's a word that sits adjacent to vulnerability that leaders are really not leaning into, which is having courage.
yeah,
Is
yeah.
having courage. And courage, it means from the heart. If you look at the Latin roots of the word courage, it means from the heart. And we there's just not a whole lot of heart. That the pursuit of that facade of which is it's through like this lens of like, what does it mean to be a man? We're all grappling. Body is grappling with what it means to be a man. Men are grappling with what it means to be a man, and women are grappling with what it means to be a man because so much of business culture is anchored in the performance of manhood. And that means vulnerability is scary. And that's why we need to have more courage. And so I think that that's a core part of what we all have to pursue in our leadership and hospitality is, yes, we need to model. We need to model vulnerability, we need to model authenticity, and we need to model courage.
I think that's beautiful. And I think it's great words to live by. I never thought we would be going down in season 2. I never thought we'd be going down the path of self-reflection and self-improvement, and but all of these things matter. And we like to say that this podcast is meant to arm hospitality people, the industry as a whole, with practical strategies. And it does not get any more practical than taking a cold, hard look in the mirror and saying, what am I bringing to my team, to my business, to my organization in order for me to succeed personally and professionally, and for that business to succeed. And I just think it's a really interesting path that we've gone down, particularly over the last couple of episodes, Rach, that we've been able to kind of dissect this. And I've been I've been so appreciative for our guests to share their insights. And as we're winding down this podcast, Kimberly, I just want to thank you for being present in the moment today. You know, you were talking about a few minutes ago, giving us the time, sharing things that you feel so passionately about, and we can hear it, you know, in your voice. It's gotten me fired up. And you know, it's great to know that, you know, it gives me optimism that people like you are out in the world writing books about these topics, sharing these experiences, consulting with others to learn how to improve and be better people, be better organizations as a whole. I feel like we've really evolved this whole conversation from a Charmander to a Charizard. Really, that's a Pokemon reference. Just I had to
Yeah, I
close.
got that much.
The Pokemon evolution.
as Rachel rolls her eyes, you know, it can't be all serious, but
No.
in all seriousness.
Somewhere my
Yeah,
husband
now I
is
want to
very
Google
proud
that.
of
I want to learn.
There you go. There you go. Well, we really appreciate you taking the time today to be with us and talk about this. It's again, I think that the best sessions, Rach, have the ones that when I leave and I'm like lost in thought for the rest of the day, thinking how I can pull some of these lessons into my own world. And I think we've done that today. And I hope our audience feels the same way. Please, when the book comes out, Kimberly, what's the name of the new book again?
It's called The Leader's Work, and it'll be available at www.builditboldly.com, where people who are looking for tools to sharpen their leadership practice and to align it with the pursuit of morality, where they can find things that will help them do that. So yes, head on over there, find me on Instagram, Kimberly McGlonn on LinkedIn. I'm absolutely here to connect with people who are on this journey of figuring out how to pursue the courage to lead in a way that meets the moment.
Fantastic. Well, I'm not going to say anymore. I'm not going to ruin that. Thanks everybody for joining us. We'll see you next time for strategy sessions. Take care of yourself and take care of others around you, everybody. Be good.
Cheers.
Thank you for joining us for strategy sessions. Please like, follow, share, and subscribe at Thirsty Bandit Co.